Picture yourself as a royal embalmer in ancient Egypt, and you've just received the most unsettling task of your profession. The pharaoh's spouse rests before you on the stone tablet. However, this isn't a typical preservation process. You've been instructed to maintain her remains in a manner that violates every holy ritual you've ever encountered, and the cause sends chills through your veins. This wasn't fantasy. This was everyday existence in ancient Egypt, where private customs were so intense they would shock contemporary sensibilities. You believe you understand Egyptian culture, the precious artifacts, the majestic rulers, the enigmatic monuments. Here's what education omits. Ancient Egypt had erotic rituals so extreme that Victorian researchers literally concealed the proof, where noble offspring experienced terrible mistreatment by their own relatives, and where spiritual celebrations transformed into week-long debauchery of brutality and intimate disorder. What I'm about to reveal will force you to reconsider everything you believed about one of history's most remarkable societies, because the reality regarding Egyptian private customs is so alarming that institutions globally attempted to conceal the proof for more than 100 years. From 3100 BCE to 30 BCE, along the productive shores of the Nile, the Egyptians created customs that would startle even the most progressive contemporary thinkers. This wasn't solely about individual enjoyment or spiritual observance. It concerned universal authority, supernatural might, and the methodical employment of eroticism as an instrument of political supremacy. The pharaohs weren't merely monarchs. They were deities in human form whose private acts were thought to directly influence the fruitfulness of the Nile, the prosperity of crops, and the continuation of Egyptian society itself. This generated immense stress to demonstrate celestial virility through progressively more outrageous exhibitions. The proof derives from temple carvings that visitors never observe, ancient scrolls detailing rituals too graphic for exhibition halls, and archaeological findings that Victorian academics intentionally kept from public knowledge. When 19th-century explorers initially discovered graphic depictions in Egyptian burial sites and shrines, they were so appalled that they either obliterated the proof or secured it in private archives. Egyptian civilization functioned on the concept that erotic force was universal force. Each instance of closeness was potentially a spiritual rite, each climax a dialogue with deities, each erotic posture a type of devotion. This ideology fostered a society where the distinctions between veneration and closeness, between spiritual obligation and individual gratification, entirely vanished. However, this universal eroticism possessed an ominous aspect. Offspring born into privileged households became ensnared in a structure that regarded their forms as sacred possessions. Household servants endured methodical erotic mistreatment that was regarded as not only permissible but spiritually essential. And when disasters occurred, when the Nile failed to rise or harvests perished, the erotic customs grew progressively frantic and brutal. The finding that altered everything occurred not in some spectacular tomb unearthing, but in a tranquil laboratory in 1925. Howard Carter's crew was performing the initial thorough inspection of Tutankhamun's preserved body when they observed something that would plague Egyptology for the following 100 years. The young ruler's reproductive organs were absent, not harmed, not decomposed, but surgically excised with the exactness of an expert medical practitioner. The incision marks were neat, intentional, and indicated tongue. Hay were created shortly after demise as component of the preservation procedure. However, Tutankhamun wasn't isolated. As additional royal preserved remains were analyzed utilizing progressively advanced methods, an alarming trend appeared. Numerous pharaohs and aristocrats demonstrated indications of reproductive organ excision or alteration. Certain ones had been entirely emasculated. Others exhibited proof of enhancement operations involving the implantation of alien substances. The most startling finding originated from the burial chamber of an unidentified royal from the 18th dynasty. His preserved remains displayed not merely absent reproductive organs, but proof that the excision had occurred while he remained alive. Medical examination of the skeletal framework and cellular remnants indicated this wasn't a penalty or mishap, but an intentional spiritual operation. Ancient Egyptian writings started to create alarming comprehension. Allusions to rendering the deceased more flawless for the existence beyond death, accounts readying the form for everlasting devotion to deities, and directions for altering the departed to guarantee appropriate supernatural operation in the subsequent realm. The consequences were astonishing. If the Egyptians habitually altered the reproductive organs of their deceased, what did this indicate regarding their perspectives toward eroticism in the human form? Were these alterations exclusively after death, or did they mirror customs conducted on the living too? But possibly most alarming of everything was the methodical manner Victorian researchers had concealed this proof. When initial Egyptologists encountered graphic erotic depictions or proof of reproductive organ alteration, they didn't merely disregard it, they deliberately repressed it, eliminating relics from public observation and omitting accounts from official documents. For more than 100 years, the actual scope of Egyptian erotic customs has been hidden not by ancient concealment, but by contemporary embarrassment and Victorian modesty that couldn't acknowledge what the proof obviously revealed. However, the absent reproductive organs were merely the commencement of what investigators discovered. The Egyptian erotic authority structure functioned through an intricate hierarchy that dictated every facet of private existence. At the apex were the pharaohs whose erotic abilities were regarded as essential to Egypt's continuation. Beneath them, aristocrats and clergy experienced immense stress to demonstrate their value through erotic exhibitions and spiritual dedication. At the foundation were household servants, especially minors, who endured methodical mistreatment that was not only permitted but spiritually required. Noble offspring born into this structure encountered an especially dreadful destiny. Ancient Egyptian writings detail how privileged households would consecrate their youngest offspring to temple duty, where they would be instructed in erotic methods from a tender age. These minors, some merely 6 or 7 years old, were instructed that their forms belonged not to themselves but to the deities. The instruction was thorough and merciless. Minors mastered particular stances, methods for extending enjoyment, and procedures for sustaining excitement during prolonged spiritual observances. They were instructed to separate from their own physical perceptions, to regard their forms as implements rather than individual possessions. Medical scrolls detailed the physical consequences this instruction inflicted on young forms. Minors developed persistent injuries from compulsory suppleness instruction. Their development was frequently impeded by inadequate nourishment intended to preserve youthful dimensions favored by mature patrons. Numerous perished from internal wounds or ailments connected to premature erotic engagement. However, the MONSTROUS stretched considerably beyond temple instruction. Affluent Egyptian households habitually utilized their household servants for enjoyment, with minors being especially valued for their assumed innocence and adaptability. Legal records demonstrate that juvenile servants could be purchased and traded specifically for erotic intentions, with their worth established by age, looks, and instruction. The psychological consequences were catastrophic. Those who survived to maturity exhibited indications that contemporary psychologists would identify as extreme trauma. They struggled establishing ordinary connections, frequently became erotically obsessive or entirely detached, and commonly perished prematurely from what historical writings metaphorically termed shattered spirits. Possibly most alarming was how this mistreatment was rationalized via spiritual teachings. Clergy instructed that erotic devotion to deities constituted the ultimate manner of veneration, that minors selected for such devotion were fortunate rather than harmed. Relatives were urged to feel privileged when their offspring were chosen for temple obligations, even when they comprehended the actual character of what would transpire. The commercial aspect introduced another stratum of terror. Archaeological findings indicate a 73% death percentage among temple juveniles, with medical examinations revealing ceremonies that required as long as 6 hours to conclude. Affluent sponsors paid extravagant fees for access to juvenile servants, financing a methodical commerce of mistreatment that persisted for thousands of years. However, if you believe that's the most terrible ordeal Egyptian juveniles encountered, you're unprepared for what follows. This methodical mistreatment was insignificant compared to what transpired during the Feast of Intoxication, Egypt's most infamous spiritual observance. What I'm about to unveil involves customs so intense that when in Itai, investigators uncovered proof, they literally incinerated the manuscripts instead of interpreting them for public viewing. What I'm about to portray will render everything you just heard resemble a juvenile tale. The subsequent custom merges spiritual devotion with erotic brutality on a magnitude that would appall even contemporary spectators. It encompassed an entire civilization plunging into week-long debauchery of anarchy, and the archaeological proof confirms it genuinely occurred precisely as historical sources depict. Before we explore the most alarming segment, press that like button if you can tolerate what follows, and certainly remark beneath to inform me where you're viewing from. I find it remarkable that individuals globally are united by identical fascination regarding humanity's most obscure historical aspects. The Feast of Intoxication represented the supreme zenith of Egyptian erotic radicalism, a yearly observance devoted to the goddess Hathor that converted the entire civilization into a week-long debauchery of brutality, eroticism, and spiritual anarchy. What commenced as commemoration of celestial femininity developed into something that would be deemed an atrocity against mankind by contemporary benchmarks. The observance's origins resided in Egyptian mythology, specifically the narrative of Sekhmet, the lioness deity who almost annihilated humanity during an intoxicated fury. According to lore, the deities had to inundate Egypt with beer blended with red pigment to make Sekhmet believe she was consuming blood, causing her to become so inebriated that she neglected her deadly mission and transformed into the milder Hathor. This myth became the blueprint for a yearly commemoration that encouraged every Egyptian to drink themselves into a condition of celestial occupancy. But the observance extended far beyond mere inebriation. Attendees believed that during their intoxicated state, they became containers for the deities themselves, liberated to act upon any urge without ethical or legal repercussions. The preparations commenced months beforehand. Temple officials would ferment enormous quantities of beer, frequently adding mind-altering compounds derived from lotus blossoms and other vegetation. The resulting concoction didn't merely intoxicate, it generated hallucinations and significantly diminished inhibitions. Participants reported experiencing visions, hearing celestial voices, and feeling inhabited by supernatural powers. When the observance commenced, customary societal regulations entirely vanished. Owners engaged in erotic acts with servants in public areas. Married women deserted their households to join wandering groups of celebrants. Minors were exposed to explicit erotic activities and frequently became participants themselves. The entire civilization plunged into anarchy that persisted for 7 days and evenings. Historical writings depict scenes that startle even contemporary readers. Mobs of intoxicated Egyptians would rampage through urban areas, invading residences and compelling residents to join their festivities. Women experienced group mistreatment that was regarded as spiritual unity. Men competed to determine who could sustain erotic stimulation for the extended durations while thoroughly intoxicated. The brutality was as intense as the eroticism. Participants would assault each other with erotic frenzy, nipping, clawing, and causing injuries that were considered symbols of celestial favor. Some revelers perished from internal wounds inflicted by violent erotic acts. Others were crushed by mobs of intoxicated participants moving through narrow thoroughfares. The spiritual rationalization rendered everything additionally alarming. Clergy taught that any action perforce made during the observance was by definition sacred since participants were inhabited by celestial spirits. Mistreatment became spiritual unity. Violence became consecrated offering. Juvenile mistreatment became celestial benediction. International visitors left accounts that reveal worldwide revulsion at these commemorations. Mesopotamian envoys characterized the observance as verification that Egyptians were barbarians masquerading as a refined civilization. Certain kingdoms refused to dispatch ambassadors to Egypt during observance periods, fearing for their safety and ethical corruption. The observance's aftermath was as traumatic as the occurrence itself. Participants frequently possessed no recollection of their actions while intoxicated, resulting in psychological trauma upon discovering evidence of their deeds. Families were devastated when members learned what their relatives had done during the commemoration. Offspring born 9 months after the observance faced stigma as progeny of celestial occupancy rather than ordinary conception. The commercial consequences were staggering. Entire municipalities would cease operations for a week while the populace engaged in intoxicated revelry. Agricultural labor halted, commerce suspended, and governmental operations paralyzed. The expense in lost productivity was immense, but pharaohs regarded it as an essential expenditure to preserve universal equilibrium. The observance additionally served political functions. By providing a pressure release for societal friction, it enabled the Egyptian system to maintain rigid hierarchy for most of the year. Citizens could rebel against authority, owners could be humiliated by servants, and social standards could be violated, but only during this meticulously controlled period of anarchy. Archaeological proof confirms the extreme character of these observances. Excavations of temple locations reveal specialized chambers designed for group erotic activities, with features suggesting they were utilized for violent and degrading acts. The physical proof matches the alarming accounts left by historical writers. The methodical collapse of Egyptian erotic culture commenced during the Ptolemaic era, when Greek rulers attempted to enforce Aegean principles upon Egyptian spiritual practices. The conflict between Greek rationalism and Egyptian erotic mysticism created a crisis that ultimately destroyed both systems. The Ptolemies, despite being foreign rulers, felt obligated to participate in Egyptian spiritual observances to maintain legitimacy with their subjects, but their Greek sensibilities were horrified by the extreme erotic customs they encountered. Cleopatra attempted to reform the Feast of Intoxication, reducing its duration and imposing restrictions on the brutality and public eroticism. These reforms triggered a spiritual crisis. Egyptian priests argued that modifying the observance would anger the deities and bring cosmic calamity. They indicated natural catastrophes, military losses, and financial difficulties as proof that deities were already displeased with external meddling in holy customs. The crisis intensified during Cleopatra III's rule, who confronted the insurmountable challenge of appeasing both Egyptian spiritual expectations and Roman political requirements. Roman witnesses were appalled by Egyptian erotic customs, regarding them as indicators of savagery and ethical deterioration. But Egyptian clergy threatened insurrection if traditional observances were completely forsaken. Cleopatra's resolution involved crafting clandestine observance versions for Egyptian spiritual authorities while exhibiting a more restrained public image for Roman spectators. This arrangement contented nobody and fostered a culture of duplicity that weakened both Egyptian spiritual legitimacy and Roman political authority. The exploitation of minors grew increasingly methodical throughout this era, as desperate rulers attempted to demonstrate their fidelity to Egyptian traditions while concealing proof from Roman supervision. Juvenile servants were smuggled in greater quantities, their mistreatment conducted in concealed chambers Roman officials were forbidden to enter. The psychological impact on Egyptian civilization was immense. Generations of minors had been nurtured within a structure that normalized erotic brutality and spiritual radicalism. When external pressure compelled modifications to these customs, numerous Egyptians experienced cultural trauma. They had forfeited not merely spiritual traditions, but their complete conceptual framework for comprehending eroticism and divine connection. The ultimate disintegration occurred with Roman annexation in 30 CEE. Augustus Caesar was horrified by discoveries his forces made in Egyptian shrines and promptly mandated eradication of erotic spiritual customs. Roman soldiers demolished explicit artwork, incinerated spiritual manuscripts, and executed clergy who declined to abandon traditional ceremonies. But Romans didn't merely suppress Egyptian erotic customs, they methodically obliterated proof of their existence. Shrines were stripped of explicit adornments. Papi detailing erotic ceremonies were burned. Even architectural elements designed for spiritual eroticism were demolished or concealed. Minors ensnared within this structure encountered particularly tragic destinies. Many had been so comprehensively conditioned for erotic servitude they couldn't acclimate to ordinary existence. Roman records describe former temple juveniles who perished by suicide rather than confront a reality where their sole perceived worth had vanished. Survivors carried trauma affecting Egyptian civilization for generations. The methodical erotic mistreatment had established behavioral patterns and convictions that couldn't be readily eliminated through political conquest. Roman administrators documented persistent issues with subterranean erotic cults, juvenile trafficking networks, and spiritual movements attempting to restore traditional customs clandestinely. But even Romans couldn't annihilate all evidence. What remained would startle Victorian archaeologists into creating archaeology's greatest concealment. The methodical suppression of Egyptian erotic customs originated not with ancient conspiracies, but with Victorian ethical standards incapable of processing archaeological reality. When 19th-century explorers initially encountered explicit erotic imagery in Egyptian tombs and shrines, they confronted a cultural dilemma that molded Egyptology for subsequent centuries. The pattern emerged early. When Giovanni Belzoni uncovered explicitly erotic wall paintings within C's tomb during 1817, he immediately commanded them plastered over rather than recorded. His published account depicted the tomb as housing exquisite spiritual scenes while entirely omitting the graphic erotic content filling multiple chambers. This became standard procedure throughout Victorian times. Auguste Marat, Egyptian Antiquity Services founder, maintained private collections of explicit relics never publicly exhibited. When Cairo's Egyptian Museum was founded, entire artifact categories were confined to restricted storage areas accessible only to male scholars. The suppression wasn't confined to imagery. Victorian translators consistently edited erotic content from ancient texts, substituting explicit descriptions with euphemistic expressions or entirely omitting complete passages. The renowned Eares's Papyrus, among ancient Egypt's most significant medical manuscripts, contained over 40 sections addressing erotic customs untranslated until the 1970s. Possibly most alarming was methodical evidence destruction. British archaeologist Flender Petrie openly confessed demolishing artifacts he deemed too obscene for public exposure. His journals described incinerating papyri, shattering sculptures, and concealing artifacts depicting erotic acts he couldn't document. The concealment extended to academic institutions. Universities declined funding research into Egyptian eroticism, deeming it unsuitable for scholarly investigation. Students expressing interest in these subjects were discouraged or expelled. Academic periodicals rejected papers discussing erotic customs even when supported by substantial archaeological evidence. Museums developed sophisticated systems for concealing erotic artifacts. The British Museum alone possesses over 2,800 suppressed Egyptian artifacts stored in restricted access areas labeled merely as miscellaneous pottery or decorative objects. As recently as 2019, the Louvre was discovered concealing newly unearthed papyri from public view. Even Wikipedia articles concerning these subjects are mysteriously protected from editing. Visitors specifically requesting to view these items encounter bureaucratic obstacles intended to discourage casual inquiry. New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art maintains similar restrictions. Their Egyptian galleries exhibit sanitized tomb painting versions with explicit erotic content, either concealed or digitally eliminated. Original artwork remains in storage, accessible solely to researchers demonstrating legitimate academic necessity and agreeing to stringent confidentiality requirements. Even today, this Victorian legacy continues molding public comprehension of ancient Egypt. Popular documentaries and museum exhibitions emphasize political history, spiritual convictions, and artistic accomplishments while completely ignoring erotic customs central to Egyptian culture. The result is a sanitized historical version bearing minimal resemblance to ancient Egyptian life's complex and frequently disturbing reality. This ongoing suppression has created enormous gaps in public knowledge regarding human eroticism, spiritual customs, and social organization within history's most influential civilization. The horrors concealed within Egyptian tombs and texts reveal how readily spiritual devotion can transform into methodical mistreatment when human eroticism becomes cosmic control's instrument. For 3,000 years, Egyptian civilization established and maintained customs treating minors as erotic property, normalizing brutality as spiritual worship, and employing intimacy as political domination's weapon. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you desiring further buried truths, I've prepared another journey into history's shadows you won't want to miss. Click the video now appearing on your screen to discover another shocking chapter history attempted to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, press that subscribe button so we can continue unveiling history's layers together. These forgotten voices deserve hearing, and numerous additional stories await telling.